Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, James makes a choice that binds trust, sacrifice, and justice together when he reaches out to Phat, not just to help save a life, but to expose a truth that has been buried for too long. As Phat stands between loyalty and conscience, Diep is fighting her own battle on the farm, determined to build stability with her own hands while waiting for a future that still feels uncertain. No dramatic confrontations, no loud promises, only careful steps, dangerous decisions, and the growing weight of responsibility. Stay with us until the end, because this chapter isn't about explosions or revenge. It's about how courage often begins in silence. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. James arrived at Phat's house in the late afternoon, when the sun no longer burned, but still pressed heavily on the shoulders. He parked his motorbike outside the narrow yard and stood there for a moment, steadying his breath. This visit had been delayed too long, and both of them knew it. When Phat opened the door, his tired eyes revealed everything before a single word was spoken. Inside, the house felt unusually quiet. Phat poured tea with unsteady hands, then sat down across from James at the low wooden table. There was no need for polite conversation. Phat spoke first, his voice flat but honest. His mother's condition had worsened. The doctors had scheduled surgery soon, and the costs kept rising. 600 million VND. He had managed to gather 500, borrowing from relatives, selling what little he could, exhausting every option. The remaining amount felt impossibly far away. James listened without interrupting. When Phat finished, James reached into his bag and placed a thick stack of cash on the table. 500 million VND. The sound it made against the wood was soft, but the meaning was overwhelming. "Use this for your mother's surgery," James said calmly. Phat recoiled as if struck. He immediately pushed the money back, shaking his head. Pride flared in his eyes, mixed with fear. "I can't take this. You need money too. For your work, your future." James didn't raise his voice. He simply met Phat's gaze. "Your mother's life comes first. This isn't charity. It's a loan. You pay me back when you're able." The room fell silent. Phat stared at the money, then at James, emotions colliding inside him. Years of poor choices weighed heavily on his chest. Finally, his shoulders sagged. He bowed his head and pulled the money back toward himself, gripping it tightly. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. "I won't forget this." James nodded, relief mixing with unease. This decision wasn't simple generosity. It tied their fates closer together than ever. After a moment, James spoke again, slower this time. He told Phat what he needed next. Not money, not favors, truth. He asked Phat to continue quietly observing his own father, to gather real evidence of illegal dealings, documents, records, anything that could stand up to scrutiny. Phat didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. "I've lived too long pretending not to see," he said. "If this helps stop him, I'll do it." That promise marked a turning point. James felt it clearly. From that moment, they weren't just helping each other survive. They were moving towards something far more dangerous, and far more necessary. James left the house as the light began to fade, his mind racing. Justice was no longer an abstract idea. It had names, faces, and consequences. While James carried that weight with him, Diep was fighting her own battles at the farm. She spent the afternoon reinforcing the garden path, carefully placing stones where the soil had eroded. Sweat soaked her shirt, but her movements were deliberate. This land mattered. Every detail mattered. She directed the workers calmly, instructing them where to strengthen the fence and which sections would be replaced with bamboo the next day. Her voice held authority now, earned through effort rather than confidence alone. Inside, pressure pressed down on her constantly. Financial strain, responsibility, the future she was trying to secure. But she didn't slow down. Each stone she set into place felt symbolic. She wasn't waiting for stability anymore. She was building it. Later, she stepped aside to make a call. She spoke with her aunt about the grapefruit harvest, asking how much had been picked and whether the remaining trees could be finished by nightfall. She arranged extra workers for the next day to help sort and pack different grades, promising payment without hesitation. The work was progressing, but Diep's mind refused to relax. She wanted everything done properly. No mistakes, no weak points. When the call ended, Diep stood quietly for a moment, surveying the farm. The wind moved through the leaves, carrying dust and the scent of soil. This was exhausting, but it was hers, and she refused to let it collapse. As evening approached, James passed through the market on his way home. He stopped when the smell of roasted duck drifted through the air. He hadn't planned to buy anything, but he did anyway. A simple decision, one that felt important. When he reached home, he called out before even stepping inside. Nye came running, her energy instantly filling the small house. James held the warm bag behind his back, smiling as he asked her to guess what he brought. Nye rattled off possibilities, growing more excited with each wrong answer until she finally guessed correctly. James laughed, genuinely, the tension of the day loosening its grip for the first time. They sat together as dusk settled outside. James asked about school, about her classes, about whether she'd earned any good child certificates recently. Nye proudly showed him two, carefully kept. One featured Doraemon, the other Pikachu. James praised her, his chest tightening with affection and regret. "I owe you a gift," he said softly. "Just give me a couple of days. I promise." Nye accepted the promise easily, her trust absolute. As they ate together, James felt the contrast sharply. Outside, his world was filled with risk, secrets, and looming consequences. Inside this small room, there was warmth, laughter, and responsibility of a different kind. He knew then that everything he was doing, every dangerous step forward, was to protect moments like this. That night, after Nye fell asleep, James sat alone for a long time. His decision was already made. He would see this through, no matter the cost. For Diep, for Nye, for the truth that had been buried too long. And quietly, without celebration or certainty, the first solid steps toward justice and toward a future where he and Diep could finally plan their wedding without fear had already been taken. The following days moved forward in silence, but it was the kind of silence that carried pressure instead of peace. Nothing outwardly changed, yet everything underneath was shifting. Phat began living two lives. By day, he acted no differently, following his father's routine, answering questions when asked, keeping his head down. By night, he reviewed what he had seen and heard, replaying conversations in his mind, connecting fragments that had once seemed meaningless. The more carefully he observed, the clearer the pattern became. Money didn't just move. It disappeared, resurfaced elsewhere, hidden behind fake contracts and shell agreements. He started small. Photographs of documents left carelessly on a desk, copies of transaction records saved onto a hidden drive. He worked slowly, knowing that speed would only invite mistakes. Each piece of evidence weighed on him. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing anymore. It was about accepting the truth of who his father really was. At the same time, James forced himself to be patient. He knew better than to rush Phat or demand results. Instead, he focused on preparation. He met quietly with a lawyer outside the district, someone with no ties to his family. They spoke in general terms at first, testing trust, discussing hypothetical situations. Only after several meetings did James begin to outline the real picture. The lawyer listened carefully, then said one thing that stayed with James long after the meeting ended. Once this starts, it won't stop. Be sure you're ready for the consequences. James was ready. Or at least, he believed he was. On the farm, Diep felt the strain building from another direction. The new buyer she had been negotiating with demanded consistency, strict grading standards, and tighter delivery schedules. It was an opportunity that could secure long-term stability, but it also meant raising expectations across the entire operation. She spent long hours organizing workers, revising packing procedures, and double-checking quality. There were moments when exhaustion hit her suddenly, when she had to pause just to steady her breathing. But she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. One evening, after everyone had left, Diep sat alone on the porch, paperwork spread around her. James arrived quietly and sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. "You don't have to carry everything yourself," James finally said. Diep gave a small smile. "I know, but right now, I need to." James understood. They weren't just building a future together. They were protecting it from collapsing before it even fully existed. As the weeks passed, Phat's evidence grew stronger. One night, he overheard a phone call that left no room for doubt. Names were mentioned, numbers confirmed, deadlines discussed. He recorded the call, hands trembling slightly, knowing this single file could change everything. Not long after, Phat sent James a short message. "We need to meet." They chose a location far from town, near the river, where old storage sheds stood abandoned. When James arrived, Phat was already there, his face tense but resolved. He handed James a small flash drive. "This isn't everything," Phat said quietly, "but it's enough to prove a pattern, enough to start something real." James took the drive, nodding once. "You've done more than I ever asked." Phat didn't look relieved. "No," he said. "I've only started fixing what I ignored for too long." They parted without lingering. Both understood that from this point on, there was no return to normal. Soon after, James delivered the evidence to the lawyer. The reaction was immediate. Authorities were notified discreetly. An investigation began quietly, without public announcements, but the signs were there. James noticed unfamiliar cars near his father's office. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Tension crept into every conversation. At home, James became more careful. He avoided unnecessary confrontations, limited his movements, and made sure Nye was never left alone. He didn't tell her everything, but he prepared her in small ways, explaining routines, teaching her who to call if something felt wrong, reminding her daily that she was safe. One night, Nye asked him directly, "Why are you always thinking so hard lately?" James smiled gently, "Because I want to make sure tomorrow is better than yesterday." Nye accepted that answer without question. Diep sensed the change in James, even when he said little. She noticed how he scanned their surroundings more carefully, how his phone never left his reach. She didn't press him. Instead, she focused on keeping their shared space steady, meals on time, work organized, problems handled quickly. Their relationship shifted into something quieter, but deeper. Fewer promises spoken aloud, more understanding without words. Then came the call James had been expecting. The lawyer told him the investigation had uncovered enough preliminary evidence to move forward. More would be required, but the foundation was solid. James felt relief, but it was heavy, not light. He knew what this meant for his family name, for his father, and for himself. That night, James and Diep stood together in the garden. The path Diep had once reinforced with stones now felt symbolic in a new way. Stable, deliberate, unyielding. "Whatever happens next," James said, "it won't be simple." Diep reached for his hand. "Nothing worth having ever is." As if to prove her words, complications arose almost immediately. A worker quit without warning. A delivery was delayed. Rumors began circulating quietly through the village. Diep handled each issue calmly, refusing to let fear disrupt her judgment. Phat, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. His father grew suspicious, asking sharper questions, watching more closely. Phat maintained his composure, but the pressure wore on him. One mistake could expose everything. Late one night, Phat found something unexpected, a locked drawer his father rarely touched. Inside were contracts and transaction logs that connected directly to the evidence already gathered. This wasn't just confirmation, it was the missing link. Phat copied everything and sent a single message to James. "It's complete." James didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He acted. The final evidence was submitted. Authorities escalated the investigation. Quiet interviews began. Accounts were frozen. The situation moved beyond personal control. James prepared Diep for what might come next. Not with details, but with honesty. "Things may get messy for a while," he said, "but it's temporary." Diep nodded. "I trust you." That trust mattered more to James than anything else. In the days that followed, the weight James had carried for so long began to shift, not disappear, but redistribute. He slept a little easier. He laughed more naturally with Nye. He even allowed himself to talk with Diep about the future again, not as a distant dream, but as something approaching. They spoke quietly one night about the wedding. No dates, no grand plans, just the idea of it. Simple, honest, theirs. "I don't need anything big," Diep said. "I just want it to be peaceful." James smiled. "After everything we've been through, piece sounds perfect. As the investigation moved forward, the truth spread slowly but undeniably. James's father could no longer operate as before. Phat's role remained hidden, but his conscience felt lighter with each passing day. And in the midst of uncertainty, something solid emerged. The farm stabilized. The buyer confirmed a long-term contract. Nye continued bringing home certificates. Small victories, but real ones.